welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's programme, the Kremlin hails what it views as a more balanced US stance on Ukraine. This as Washington twice sided with Moscow in Monday voting at the United Nations. Elon Musk, who's been tasked by President Trump with rooting out government waste, renews his threat to fire federal workers who do not comply with his demand to justify their jobs. And 1 month on from the presidential election in Belarus, we'll be speaking to exiled opposition leader Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, who regards Alexander Lukashenko's 7th straight election victory as a sham. Hello and welcome to the programme. Now, in what is seen as a dramatic shift in Washington's stance on the war in Ukraine, the US has sided twice with Russia in votes at the United Nations on Monday. Well, these votes mark the third anniversary of the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Well, in the first vote at the UN General Assembly, the US voted against a European drafted resolution which condemned Moscow's invasion. Well, this means Washington voted in the same way as Russia, Belarus and North Korea. Then, at the UN Security Council, the UN voted its own resolution, which called for an end to the conflict, but which did not criticize Russia.
The result of the vote is as follows. In favor, 93, against 8, abstention 73. Draft resolution A/ES11/L11 as amended is adopted.
Well, the Kremlin has reacted, hailing what it called Washington's more balanced position. Well, the Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov told reporters he believes the new US stance will help resolve the war in Ukraine. He also noted that based on comments by European leaders, he hasn't sensed much balance from their side, but he hopes that will change after further contact between Europeans and Americans. Well, to discuss all of this further, we're joined now by Greg Swenson, who is the chair of Republicans Overseas UK, who joins us from London. Great to have you with us once again. Also great to see back again Robert Fox, the defence editor for the Evening Standard newspaper, who also joins us from London. Thank you both very much indeed for joining us. As we just heard there, the United States has sided with Russia in two UN votes. Obviously, the Kremlin very pleased with this. We just saw there the Kremlin calling this Washington's more, quote, balanced position. This is a pretty seismic shift, isn't it, Greg?
Yeah, I think to a certain degree it is. But I think the U.S. has really ceased to take seriously whatever the UN says, whether it's these security resolutions or any sort of multilateral announcements or pronouncements. I just don't think it's that big of a deal. I think a lot of the critics of it are up in arms. But on the other hand, this is just a bit of realpolitik. I mean, the war is in a stalemate right now. President Trump is trying to negotiate a ceasefire and a truce or perhaps a permanent settlement. And I don't think that UN resolutions are going to affect that either way.
OK, Rob, let me pick up on that with you. No big deal? Or would you say that the transatlantic alliance has been upended?
Well, I'd like to go midway between it. I think it's slightly more than no big deal. It's an indicator of the way things are going. Things are moving quite fast in Europe on the back of the Macron visit to the White House, the rather surprisingly dramatic announcement by Sir Keir Starmer in the House of Commons today, and there's going to be an unveiling throughout the day of a security plan long overdue, a national security strategy in the present context for the UK. And I think I think it's quite useful because I think it rehearses what is going to come in the end of June at the NATO summit in the Netherlands, where there really will be a sorting out of the future of the alliance, where, of course, there will be looser ties with America. America is absolutely essential to NATO because it was at the heart of the conception of NATO. There may be different alliances or different variants of it, but I think that's the way that they're going. But I think that what allies of America, and not just in Europe, I mean, it's very interesting what the Asian allies will be saying. It's to try and make out the real sense of direction of the Trump of the Trump presidency. It looks as if it's hegemonistic, sovereigntist, which I think is it could raise a lot of problems in what's coming up.
Yeah, and Rob, just to stay with you for a moment, I mean, in that UN General Assembly vote, the United States was on the same side as Belarus, North Korea, and Sudan. I mean, you don't think that's somewhat alarming?
Well, you do judge people by the company they keep, don't you? It is very strange to have ended up with that not one of those three has a very powerful democratic credential. Let me put it like that. I think it's they're very much part of the deal, and I think, as we heard in your introduction, is that Trump really hopes that he can make a deal which will be to the benefit of the US with this. And I think even an armistice, a freezing on the current lines in Ukraine is quite a way off. And it's going to be quite a tricky one to do. Washington clearly thinks that it could do a deal with Moscow, and Moscow is responding, it must be said. Very interesting to see which way Putin is moving, particularly on the back of the Riyadh meeting. Would join the dots and was talking about perhaps he can get together with Washington on joint ventures for exploiting minerals and strategic natural assets in Russia with American input. But also the great prizes, and this did emerge very strongly, actually, in the background at Riyadh, is the Arctic, and they want a deal there. It's looking a bit like what happened at the end of the 15th century with the line of Tordesillas, known as the Alexandrine Line, where they believed they could carve the new world between Portugal and Spain. Can you carve the old world between the US and Russia? It looks that that's the way it's going, that there are three superpowers or near superpowers involved in this: Russia, China, and Trump America. And Trump America doesn't have much time for most of its allies.
Greg, I can tell from the look on your face you quite like that comparison of us looking like we were where we were in the 15th century. Was there something you wanted to say? Yeah,
it's just an interesting historical perspective that the British have a great understanding of that. I think more so than the Americans, because we only look back 250 years. But I do think that, and Robert brings up a great point, it is strange, but President Trump is provocative. He's different. He doesn't do things the old way, and the old way has failed. And I think that's what's really important here. The neocons in America have failed at defeating Russia. You saw it even in the last 3 years. The incrementalist, the drip feeding of support from President Biden, and he would always argue that he didn't want to escalate, but he was really the champion of appeasement in his 4 years. And if you look back at Trump 1.0, it's interesting that he was much more hostile to Putin and to Russia than the Obama-Biden administration was after the invasion of Crimea, and also much more aggressive than Joe Biden was, especially in the first 2 years. But even after Russia invaded Ukraine, you saw a real slow drip feed. And in many ways, it was really a strategy of stalemate. To start with rifles and rounds, and then ultimately agree to Abrams tanks, and later agree to F-16s. and not before stopping some of our allies from delivering F-16s to Ukraine, and then stopping the training, stopping the permissions, the tech, in addition to weapons. So, I think in retrospect, we can't turn back the clock. We all wish we could to February of 2022. I'm with President Trump on that. I don't think this would have happened if it was on his watch. He was sending Javelin missiles to Ukraine, after Obama and Biden were only sending non-lethal weapons or non-lethal materials to Ukraine, and not even sending it directly to Kyiv. They were shipping it to a U.S. airbase in Poland and then trucking it on commercial trucks. Trump put sanctions on Nord Stream 2. Of course, Biden relieved those sanctions as soon as he could when he took office. So, I think that, we all wish that deterrence would have worked. I think it could have worked if Trump was still president in 21 and 22. But that ship has sailed, and we sort of have to deal with reality right now. And that's why I think Trump just wants to, get to a ceasefire, stop the killing. The stalemate's not working for anybody, especially not Ukraine.
Rob, I've been looking at your face there as Greg was talking. You seem to be mostly nodding. Do I take that as meaning that you agree largely with what was just said?
Well, I must say, Greg, there's a synergy of thought going on here. I hadn't expected it, but the way we think about this, I suspect is very, very similar indeed. And can I say, you put it crystal clear. You're absolutely right. Deterrence in any terms absolutely failed, because the failure has been, and it's been steady since Putin gave us warning, ominously, was at a Munich Security Conference in 2007 or 2008, I think it was 2007, where he laid out his vision. And then NATO went ahead. Sorry, I don't want to go too long in the anecdotage, but NATO made a terrible mistake the following year. And both our countries are to blame for it. At the Bucharest NATO summit, they said the aspiration of Georgia and Ukraine to join NATO should be realized. Could be, they didn't give a timetable, I admit, but, the Secretary of State and the Foreign Secretary, David Miliband, at that time said that, and they had no route map. They had no conception of consulting with Russia and what it might be. And in fact, the poison was in the well at that point. And I think that the real worry, and I'd be very interested in Greg's take on this, having had the Atlantic Council where Russia could meet with NATO, and in the 1990s did so quite enthusiastically in their terms. They came to NATO meetings and so on, and then it just drifted out. And I agree, from 2014 on, the Maidan upheaval and then Crimea, the lack of engagement has been spectacular. And that is the big thing. And that is where one does hand it to the Trump 2 administration. You've got to engage with Moscow.
Yeah, it looks as though you both absolutely agree on that one. And I was going to ask
You've got a rotten program, I'm afraid.
Not much of a debate, more of a agreement on this. And obviously, when Donald Trump said, we're making a decisive break with traditional U.S. foreign policy, which he described as very foolish, it sounds like you both agree with that as well. How do you think Volodymyr Zelensky, President Zelensky, has played his cards the last week or so? Greg? Yeah,
look, I think Putin wants an off-ramp. He just can't admit it, right? He's not the type that would admit that. I think he's probably worried about the long-term effects of the war on his country, on the people, on the economy. And so this is probably a welcome off-ramp. And, President Trump's strategy is not that different than, Gerhard Schroeder, Angela Merkel, even Obama and Biden, who, were afraid of provoking, didn't really want to spend too much on defense and security, obviously in the case of all four of them, and would rather do business. And it ended up being, Germany ended up being completely dependent on Russia for oil and natural gas. Obama and Biden were just kicking the can down the road, cutting defense spending at every turn. President Trump increased defense spending dramatically. So his deterrence was working, again, with the sanctions on Nord Stream, with the lethal weapons. And then Biden just, turned around, cut defense spending 3 years in a row by 3%. the U.S. is still half of NATO in terms of defense and security spending, and we're cutting 3% a year. That was really dangerous. So if the Europeans who are now flexing their muscles and saying we want to fight, we want to defend Ukraine, well, why are you spending under 2% of your GDP on defense and security? It makes no sense.
Okay, Greg, you've managed not to address the issue of President Zelensky, which was the thrust of my question. Yeah. I just wanted to know what you think of how he's played his cards the last few days, because we have seen quite a bit of friction, a bit of a war of words going on between Kyiv and Washington. I'd like to get your take on that.
Yeah, no, sorry. I thought you were talking about Putin, but Zelensky, look, he was very cooperative at first, when Trump had won the election, maybe right before the inauguration, right after, and then he got into a little heat last week. I think that was a mistake, but he's looking for an off-ramp too. And I think the fact that he conceded over the weekend that he'd be happy to resign if there was a satisfactory resolution, I think is a great sign. We're never going to get that from Putin, obviously. But, I think that was a step in the right direction. Last week, when he had a little spat with Scott Bessent and the Secretary of Treasury and with Trump himself, I thought that was a mistake because he was negotiating and he ended up cooperating in terms of the potential partnership on rare earth elements and critical minerals will be great for Ukraine, not just great for the U.S.
So let me turn back to you, Robert, because you were mentioning there the Macron visit to Washington. I would like to get your take on how you thought he got on in his discussions with President Trump and whether you thought he was listened to. And another point, just an extension of that, President Macron told Fox News that he thinks that a truce is possible in a matter of weeks. I just wondered if you agree with that.
I think, again, one is likely, but how permanent it's going to be, how frozen, how semi-freddo it might be, which is my expression for these kinds of wars we're seeing now. Now you see them frozen, now they seem to be melting rather unexpectedly. We've seen that in the Caucasus, after all, and indeed to an extent in Syria. Macron, to answer your question, I mean, let's lighten the load a bit here. They are brilliant at theatre, all these three that we've mentioned. The rather stolid, even stodgy Sir Keir Starmer isn't so good at it. Zelensky is a performer and has been doing it brilliantly. I was just watching the body language. He is exhausted, but his body language and his press conference said, well, of course, I could step down were you to guarantee NATO membership and things like that, which he knew wasn't going to come. It was absolutely classic, like the great conjurer, misdirection. Macron, as we know, Jupiter, is also a great performer. And what he is wondering about is where this takes Europe. Because actually but Trump has done him a great favor. Since we're invoking history, it's appealed to the little corporal in him. It's appealed to the Napoleon in Macron, because Macron is quite clearly on mainland Europe the leader now. He is the voice, because look where Merz is now just newly elected. Is he going to be chancellor in the terms in which he wanted to be? We have Ursula von der Leyen, and we have the feisty ladies behind her in the EU, but they're not leading Europe. And this is where Macron is actually talking, I think, behind the scenes quite seriously with Trump, and is where does the alliance sit? We know America can't have Europe as its priority now. Where do we fit with you? And this is where I think both Britain and France have a peculiarly strong role. They say, yeah, we'd like you to be a backstop in Europe still, if you can manage it, and we will help you out in the Pacific and that region, which is very, very hot. Now, I'm sorry to say, Greg, we're speaking from the UK. That change of emphasis and why it is so important to America in view of what is going on, not only with China, but elsewhere in the region, is not getting the coverage. It's not getting the mileage. It's not getting the airspace it deserves, particularly here in the UK, where it jolly well should.
Well, perhaps it will, because, Greg, as we've been saying, the British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, will go to the White House on Thursday Analysts seem to think Macron did a reasonably good job at getting his points across to President Trump. Don't know if you agree with that. But Prime Minister Starmer says he's going to show up with this new pledge of increasing defence spending that we were just talking about there. Can he act as an effective bridge, do you think, between Europe and the United States?
I think he could. It's a great opportunity for him. When I say I think he could, I don't think he necessarily will, but it would be an opportunity squandered if he doesn't. Stepping up the defense spending, you never would have expected that from Keir Starmer or Labour. Perhaps he's being forced into it, but I do think it's important for the UK. It's completely inadequate to be at 2.3%. Just like I said, it's inadequate for the US to be at 3%. So if the silver lining of this whole debacle in Ukraine over the last 3 years is that the Europeans step up and decide to take defense and security seriously, not only does it help the U.S. in the Pacific, which is really important, Robert, great point, but also the last thing we want is Russia to be aligned or dependent on the Chinese. And that's where we started to see in early 2022, when Russia was isolated from the rest of the world and leaned toward China. So in spite of this UN resolution, which President Trump probably doesn't care about, he doesn't care about multilats at all. He's really good in these bilateral meetings like he just had with Macron, and I think we'll see more of the same on Thursday. The last thing I'll mention is if Keir Starmer kicks off the conversation with the King's invitation for a state visit, first time ever that a president has had 2 state visits, that will be a great way to break the ice, I would argue.
OK, so perhaps he'll go well armed. I'll come to you in just a moment, Robert. I just want to ask you, lastly, Greg, though, we heard from the former British Prime Minister, the former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, saying when Donald Trump says something that sounds a bit outlandish, everyone panics and tries to decrypt it. But there's a method here, which is some sort of, shock tactic to get people motivated, get people into action, a sort of electric shock therapy. Sounds like you agree, based on what you were just saying, with that assessment. And it works.
Yeah, and it's worked. You saw it with the president of Colombia. It took 30 minutes and 2 holes on a golf course, and the president of Colombia reversed course on taking the illegal migrant criminals back to Colombia. And there's many other examples of it. I know it's uncomfortable for the diplomatic world and many others in the European circuit here, but I think that's just his style, and it seems to work most of the time. And so I would expect it to work again here, much like the former prime minister said.
OK, Robert, just coming to you before we wrap up, and if there's any points you want to raise in your...
Look, come on, it's not even an elephant in the room. It's so serious, and it's very important, and it's why Macron and Starmer are so important to America and its nuclear. And in fact, as we know, and I agree with Greg, the thing is that the old diplomatic way, and we've heard them chuntering on, even after the Starmer announcement, oh, you can't do this, no, you can't do that. That is arteriosclerotic. Britain and America and Australia are in this AUKUS agreement. And again, it's very difficult to get public traction and even media traction on why this is important. And it will go through many iterations and variations, but it is for real. It's something that really will stick. And by the way, I think that that's where Britain and France will have to lead Europe, and it is because of their nuclear cooperation, which is thinner, of course, than with America, but it's so important because one of the things that we're missing, and it is very, very difficult to get your head around in its new format, we're in another nuclear arms race. Welcome, Dr. Strangelove.
OK, well, you have had the last word. Thank you very much indeed to you, Robert Fox, defence editor for the Evening Standard newspaper. And thanks as well to Greg Swenson, chair of Republicans Overseas UK. Thank you very much indeed to you both. Well, stay with us. In just a moment, we'll be talking about President Donald Trump's desire to see federal employees justify their jobs, and he's giving his support to Elon Musk's demand that they send an email saying exactly what they do. That's right after this.
we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Al Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
Berlin. For its exuberant urban life and vibrant art scene, visit Berlin. The German capital features a cultural scene and unique lifestyle that's both fast-paced and relaxed. Also known as the hipster city of Europe, Berlin keeps alive with its alternative cultures and styles. In neighborhoods like Kreuzberg, Neukölln, and Friedrichshain are vibrant places where locals simply chill and enjoy the relaxed open spaces and fresh air. No city in Germany is, in fact, greener than Berlin, with its forests, lakes, and sprawling parks. Berlin is also a city full of history. The World War II, after all, began and ended in the city of Berlin. Most popular are the Brandenburg Gate and the Federal Chancellery, which are reflective of the nation's rich stories. Germany's capital is also home to its major government buildings, such as the historic Reichstag or the seat of the German parliament. Of course, most remarkable are the Berlin Wall, the East Side Gallery, and the Holocaust Memorial. Historical feats aside, Berlin is also hip and happening with its streets of bars and clubs. The city has an active nightlife that guarantees massive parties and events practically every night. But the city is friendly to non-party goers too. It has relaxed beer gardens, small bars, hostels, and art galleries to suit different tastes. Famous as a city of art, Berlin has over 170 museums, including the famous Museum Island that puts treasures of the world on public display. Tourists often visit Berlin to attend ballets and operas at the city's major opera houses, as well as witness live performances by talented orchestras such as the world-class Berlin Philharmonic. And when it comes to food, Berlin has a lot to offer too. It's a great place for vegans. It has Turkish restaurants and supermarkets everywhere, and Italian, Mexican, and Asian food spots too. Food markets offering snacks, German wine and cheese, among others, will satisfy your palate as well. The neighborhoods in Kreuzberg and Neukölln are great for finding fine restaurants and quiet lounge bars, as well as dozens of coffee bars to enjoy. When it comes to shopping, there are well-known mainstream malls to visit, alongside independent boutiques nearby that offer endless choices for your lifestyle needs. One will also find small vintage stores within Berlin, some even selling second-hand books as well as high-end designer clothing.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics, and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake, and artificial intelligence,
They've got to have a vote and a say.
it's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on The Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.
Thanks for staying with us. Now, President Donald Trump says he supports Elon Musk's demand that federal employees explain their recent accomplishments or risk losing their jobs. Well, Musk's email instructed workers to reply with 5 examples of what they'd done during the past 7 days. Well, Musk, who leads the Department of Government Efficiency, has warned that failure to respond to his email will be taken as a resignation. But his approach has fueled a backlash, with unions and activist groups filing a lawsuit to halt the email mandate. Well, President Trump has weighed in, insinuating that the government might have ghost workers.
He wanted to know what you did this week. You know why he wanted that, by the way? I thought it was great, because we have people that don't show up to work and nobody even knows that they work for the government. So by asking the question, tell us what you did this week, what he's doing is saying, are you actually working? And then if you don't answer, like you're sort of semi-fired or you're fired, because a lot of people are not answering because they don't even exist. They're trying to, that's how badly various parts of our government were run by, and especially by this last group. We have found hundreds of billions of dollars of fraud so far.
Meanwhile, President Donald Trump says he supports Elon Musk's demand that federal employees explain their recent accomplishments or risk losing their jobs. Well, Musk's email instructed workers to reply with 5 examples of what they'd done during the preceding 7 days. Well, Musk, who leads the Department of Government Efficiency, has warned that failure to respond to his email will be taken as a resignation. But his approach has fueled a backlash, with unions and activist groups filing a lawsuit to halt the email mandate. Well, President Trump has weighed in, insinuating that the government might have ghost workers.
He wanted to know what you did this week. You know why he wanted that, by the way? I thought it was great, because we have people that don't show up to work and nobody even knows that they work for the government. So by asking the question, tell us what you did this week, what he's doing is saying, are you actually working? And then if you don't answer, like you're sort of semi-fired or you're fired, because a lot of people are not answering because they don't even exist. They're trying to, that's how badly various parts of our government were run by, and especially by this last group. We have found hundreds of billions of dollars of fraud so far.
President Donald Trump speaking there. Well, for more analysis, we can speak now to Florida Republican Executive Committeewoman Angie Wong. Angie, great to have you with us here once again on Al Arabiya News. Elon Musk has sent out this email telling federal employees, tell me what you did last week. Just talk us through what you think the thinking here is.
Well, anytime a company takes over another company in a merger or an acquisition, you go through an audit. And that's exactly how Donald Trump and Elon Musk are going about their approach. They have just received a broken U.S. economy as well as a broken administration, and they're trying to fix it. So the first thing Elon Musk is going to go and do, as any sensible person would do, any CPA, which is a certified public accountant, would do, is to go and do a line audit. And what we are finding in this process is a lot of wastage, a lot of federal employees who don't exactly work, and they're saying, well, what's going on here? So I don't think this is a bad request to say, well, what exactly are your job duties? Because any HR person would go and ask those very questions. So why there's so much pushback by Democrats and other federal employees, it's actually kind of strange to me. It's a simple question in an email that Elon Musk has asked. List the 5 things that you've done this week. Most employees can fill that out. That's not a hard question. I had just heard this morning that Elon Musk has given a second email in response to the first batch that came in, which only a certain percentage of people had responded to. These are 3 million federal workers, right? And we know that we're trying to cut costs. In fact, he has a mandate to try to find and cut $2 trillion from the federal budget. So all of this is just processes. And I hope that federal workers will comply.
Yeah, you used the analogy of an auditor there. We spoke to Elon Musk's father yesterday, and he told us that his son is worse than an auditor, and he doesn't miss anything. So he sounds pretty tough. Just talking about the numbers here. So between 2.3 and 3 million federal workers, we understand. Back in the 1950s, that represented about 4% of the total workforce. But today, that represents about 1.4% of the total workforce, which is actually a historic low. So is this really such a serious problem?
is if you're trying to find ways of cutting the budget. Look, the ultimate goal here is for Trump to have less taxes for American taxpayers, if not zero taxes. I think that's what he really wants to achieve. Whether or not that's going to happen within 4 years, Donald Trump at this point, it seems as though he can do anything, especially with Elon Musk's help. They have already in just 30 days found lots of cost-cutting measures. Now, the biggest measure in any company or government is usually going to be your personnel. So from what I've understood, they have already notified 30,000 federal employees that there's going to be layoffs. And now, so the first cut has already been done, or at least it's in the process of being cut. And Donald Trump has offered a severance package, I believe, of 8 months of pay, which just seems pretty good. A lot of people are voluntarily resigning. But then the next round is going to be a little bit harder. Now, HR is trying to decide, or rather DOGE, which has become the human resource department for the government, they're trying to decide, well, where else can we cut? What do you do exactly? And one of the mandates is, well, you have to return to an on-site office to do your work. You can no longer just be at home in your pajamas pretending to work. So that has, gotten a lot of people kind of uproar. And it's really strange because now we're seeing the kind of the echo and the effects, the ripple effects of DOGE. I just heard the Miami mayor announce this morning, that she is demanding for employees to go back in office on site to work in the Miami offices again. And this is the local workers. So you're starting to see governments doing this. It's pretty incredible how many people we were not monitoring. And, maybe they were being managed on some level. But for the most part, a lot of people just never showed up and collected a check.
OK, but isn't there a bit of concern in the US that this sort of slash and burn approach is actually going to translate into higher unemployment figures? That's not going to look too good, is it?
No, of course not. And again, I think there's going to be some of that. Whenever you go and do a hard audit like that, yeah, it's going to lay off some people. But that's OK, because I think it was time, because there was a lot of fat in the government. If you ask any ordinary worker today, they're looking at their paycheck every month and they're saying, well, I just gave away 50% of my paycheck, but to whom and for what? And we found that a lot of money was going overseas to various extraneous programs that a lot of American workers do not support. So now we're hoping to bring that number down from 50% of my pay cut, or my paycheck rather, to maybe 10% or maybe less than that. So, I mean, all these things are good things for Americans ultimately, and employment, even though the numbers might look like they're going down temporarily, all Americans get to benefit from a lower tax rate. So I think that is the ultimate goal.
Yeah, I mean, unemployment is only around 4% in the United States. So in fact, this administration has inherited at least a reasonable situation when it comes to joblessness. But when it comes to, all of that collective experience in these federal departments, and we're talking about hundreds of years worth of collective experience, is there a bit of worry that perhaps he's going a bit far here?
A bit far. Well, we haven't done enough for the American people in decades. So you do need a disruptor like a Donald Trump, like an Elon Musk to come in. And it's going to hurt for a while. I will tell you one thing about egg prices here in the U.S. It's almost $1 an egg now, right? If not more, depending on where you shop. And it's going to hurt. We're going to feel the effects because you're going through a transition period where now Americans will have to manufacture more because we've cut off a lot of the trade deals. And we've also tariffed a lot of the countries bringing in our goods. You're going to see that in temporary employment as well. You're going to see a lot of these transitional kind of painful moments, but it's only temporary because at the other end of it, you're going to start seeing the benefits of it. And I think that's going to come faster than we can imagine. That you have two titans here running the country, which I'm very proud of.
OK, just going back to this email instruction. So people have been told if you don't reply to the email setting out what you've achieved, then that'll be taken as a resignation. Some federal workers have been told by their seniors, oh, you can just ignore the email. Don't worry about it. You don't have to reply. It's difficult to understand what's going on here. Is this voluntary or isn't it? What's your understanding?
My understanding is the very first email went out to all federal workers to just say, well, what is it that you do? And for senior management, their bosses, to say, well, you don't have to really comply to it. There's really no laws here. In fact, it's better off that you don't write in. Well, that is very, very suspect to me, because one of the things that I think is happening is that you're going to have a team who have, they work on the same team, but they have very different answers and very different duties, and they may not calculate or rather correlate. And maybe it's going to be discovered that there's some management problems. And maybe that's why the managers are asking them not to fill out these forms. As of today, Elon Musk has sent out a second email, which I take to be a second warning. If you haven't already replied to the very first email request, well, here's number 2. And if you don't reply to that, you may be let go. That is exactly how human resources work, right? You have essentially your boss, your top boss, the president, asking you to tell us what you do and whether or not you should keep your job. I don't think that is a hard ask at all. I think that is a very basic management skill, and it's definitely worth replying. So if you don't reply, it's very likely that these employees will let go and let in new patriots and new Americans who want to work in those jobs, who are excited about this administration. Let them get those jobs.
Do you think a bit of it boils down to resentment that Elon Musk is, he's not an American, and he has not had approval from the US Senate to be in the position he's in, prompting people to raise questions about his authority? Do you think there is an element of that in the response to this instruction?
Well, they're trying to push the message that he's not American. I believe he has been naturalized. He is a great American. We see him every single day working nonstop. And this is a billionaire, one of the richest men in the world, who is working nonstop for his country and sleeping in a sleeping bag. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And you have to remember that most bureaucrats are not elected, and they're not even selected in an appointment scenario. He is asked to work as an auditor for this country and to find out what is going on here. Now, I don't know of anyone else better suited to do this job. I mean, there's only a couple of people who have run large companies who even know how to do this, right? So I think he's doing a fantastic job. It's a thankless job. Even this morning, we were seeing threats on his life being put out by all over a lot of blue cities. So, it is ultimately, he's not getting paid a government salary. He's doing this because he really cares about cleaning up this mess once and for all. And hopefully after 4 years' time, we're going to leave this country in a better off place.
Do you think he has to cool it, as his dad said to us yesterday, perhaps, appearing on a stage with a chainsaw, casting himself as the Doge father with, loud, heavy metal music playing in the background and, slashing jobs? I mean, these are people with livelihoods, with bills to pay, with, households to feed. I mean, the optics matter, don't they?
The optics do matter. And Tom, you know this, politics is entertainment. It's certainly with this administration, where most of the administration comes with a TV background, right? So with Elon Musk coming on stage, in full theatrics, you know what it's doing? It's exciting Americans. And that is one of the things that we lack so desperately with the last administration, where we were just all sleeping. We weren't paying attention because it was boring. Now you have an exciting, young, energetic administration coming in. They're going to be slashing prices. They're going to be slashing your taxes. They're going to be bringing back and putting money into Americans' pockets. I mean, we're excited and we should be celebrating. So if there are fireworks on stage and Elon Musk jumping up and down, I'm okay with that, because that to me is the new young energy that we've been craving for the last 4 years.
Just lastly, Angie, I mean, we talked some weeks ago about some of the nominees for the Trump administration. You were spot on with one or two of them, saying you weren't comfortable with them. Sure enough, they weren't named. I want to get your prediction on something else now. I mean, a lot of people suggesting that, with two strong characters like Donald Trump and Elon Musk pretty much at the helm of the United States as a duo, Do you think there's some scope here for some sparks? Do you reckon it's a matter of time before they have a bit of a falling out? What do you think?
Well, I think they actually complement each other very well, Donald Trump and Elon Musk. You have Donald Trump, who's doing a lot of the international dealings right now. You had Macron, who just visited, and the Japanese prime minister, etc., and also Bibi Netanyahu. So he's doing a lot of the world stage stuff, whereas Elon Musk is the workhorse, right? He is literally going line by line, or rather his team is going line by line, making sure that Americans are not paying for products and budgets of other countries. We just saw a line item for Thai healthcare and Mali's education. Well, why are we paying for their domestic line items? Why are Americans doing that? And those are kind of larger discussions to have. But, I'm glad someone's doing it, because we were just taking on a lot of various countries' own budgets, and Americans did not know that. I just found that out, and I was like, I'm glad someone is doing a proper audit. So we'll see what that comes with. I don't think that these two men are really going to fight or have a falling out. I really think that they complement each other. They work well together, and they don't really cross paths all that much, other than, on messaging. So far, it seems like they are both in agreement, and, they seem like they're really, really good for the country. As I've said before, with Donald Trump, there's always trouble around the corner. The media is certainly trying to find that. I don't think they're going to find it with this dream team.
All right. Well, thank you very much indeed. Florida Republican Executive Committee woman, Angie Wong. Always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Now, according to the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, Belarus has been flagged as a potential launch pad for a future attack on Ukraine. Well, he raised the alarm at the Munich Security Conference last week. Well, President Zelensky stated that Russia is preparing 15 divisions with between 100 and 150,000 troops being trained to escalate tensions along the Belarus border. Well, he also warned that Russia may not only target Ukraine, but could also attack Poland or other Baltic countries. Well, Zelensky expressed concern over how the US would respond to such developments. Well, Zelensky's comments followed the ratification of a treaty by Russian lawmakers last week, offering security guarantees to Belarus, including the potential use of Russia's nuclear weapons to repel any aggression. Well, speaking to the State Duma, the Russian Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Alexander Grushko, emphasized that the treaty has a defensive nature and is not directed against any other countries or alliances such as NATO.
The treaty has a defensive nature and is not directed against any other countries or alliances. Its creation is motivated by the need to strengthen stability and security against the increasing fragility and unpredictability of the situation in the military field on the western borders of our union state. The main purpose of the treaty is to consolidate the common defense and security framework of the union state, as well as to send a clear signal to the external circuit in order to deter aggressive intentions of NATO countries against Russia and Belarus.
Well, today we're going to be speaking to Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, who is a former teacher who, with no political experience, ran against the Belarusian president, Alexander Lukashenko, in the 2020 presidential election. Well, after Lukashenko, who has ruled Belarus for more than 30 years, claimed victory with more than 80% of the vote, Tsikhanouskaya fled to Lithuania with her 2 children. Well, her departure followed massive protests, with many opposition groups believing that she was the true winner. Well, in 2023, a Belarusian court sentenced her in absentia to 15 years in prison on charges of high treason and conspiracy to seize power. Well, let's get more now. We can speak to Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, an exiled Belarusian politician, leader of the Democratic Forces of Belarus and former 2020 presidential candidate. Thank you so much for being with us, Sviatlana. Just so that our audience understands, you're joining us from Lithuania, and I'm assuming that's because if you were in Belarus, you wouldn't be safe. Tell us why that is.
When back in 2020, I was a presidential candidate, and according to all votes accounting, I won elections. KGB forced me to leave the country. And they thought if the leader is in exile, so all the uprising, resistance will stop. But it wasn't our case, because several months in a row, uprising demonstrations on the people of Belarus continued. Just they demanded Lukashenko to leave. So for this almost 5 years already in exile, Lukashenko's regime started trial against me. I was sentenced for 15 years in absentia, and of course I can't return home because I will be immediately jailed.
Okay, and of course, two of the key opposition figures there in Belarus in the 2020 election were jailed. We're talking here about Viktor Babariko and Sergei Tsikhanouskaya, and he is in fact your husband. And I just want to ask you whether you imagined that you would one day become this figurehead of the opposition in Belarus, or did it happen by accident?
Absolutely. I never intended to go into politics, and I call myself an accidental politician. Because when my husband, Sergei Tsikhanouskaya, announced he would run against dictator Lukashenko, he was arrested immediately. And I stood in his place, not because I wanted to be a politician, but because someone had to continue the fight my husband started. And actually, my story is not unique, because it's the story of every Belarusian who stood up against regime and chose freedom over fear. Belarusians don't want to live under dictatorship. We don't want to live under Russia either. And we want just to be a normal democratic European nation. And this is what we are fighting for till now.
Okay, and you've had the same leader since 1994, so that's more than 30 years now. Alexander Lukashenko has won 7 elections in a row. And what does that do? What does that mean for the opposition? What's left of the opposition?
So first of all, let me correct you, because at least 2 last so-called elections, Lukashenko didn't win, because all these elections were falsified, and elections 2020 and this farce of 2025 wasn't recognized as real elections, no by Belarusian people, no by international community. But of course, for these years of Lukashenko's governing, and after 2020, when he seized power in the country, he managed to make from Belarus like Gulag. People live like in Stalin's time, repressions. People live in constant fear, because every day people are detained for their anti-regime or anti-war or pro-Ukrainian position. And Lukashenko has only one instrument, is tyranny and terror against Belarusian people. For these 5 years, he dragged our country into the war against our neighbors, Ukrainians, against the will of Belarusian people, and he is selling our country to Russia piece by piece. There is a process of Russification in Belarus. So actually, Lukashenko is selling our independence and selling our sovereignty to Russia. He's ready to sacrifice everything Belarusian to stay in power. Lukashenko is backed up by Putin, because Putin needs Belarus to be a launching pad for attacking Ukraine and for future possible attacks on our other neighbors, and they are like allies. But Belarusians, despite all these repressions, despite all this terror and everyday detentions, people continue to fight on the ground and in exile.
Okay, so in the latest elections that were held in Belarus, how did people who oppose Lukashenko vote? Did they vote at all? Did they abstain? Were there other candidates? How did it work?
May I underline once again that what this event that was organized by Lukashenko has nothing in common with democratic processes. It's a ritual. We call it special electoral operation. It just, Lukashenko's circus of reappointment by dictator, new dictator. So that it is. But of course, people of Belarus, they wanted to show somehow, their attitude to this. And when they were at polling stations, if the regime forced them to go to polling stations, they put this tick against everybody. We understand that nobody counted the ballots. Nobody was interested in people's opinion, but people need, this step. But in 2020, people went to the streets to defend their voices, defend their votes, and they were harshly repressed. 5 years in a row, people are detained every day for their anti-regime position. This year, I didn't call people to go to the streets, didn't want people to sacrifice themselves in vain. I asked people to keep their energy, to keep their, desire to fight for the real moment of opportunity. This imitation of elections doesn't change anything for Belarus. Lukashenko remains be ally of Putin. He continues to provide Belarusian territory and the infrastructure for Russia. So I really want to believe that very soon the new window of opportunity will be opened for Belarus, and then we will see Belarusians with their voices on the streets, and everywhere.
Of course, Belarus has been under heavy sanctions by the West for a number of years now. I'm just wondering how damaging they've been for Belarus and how much pressure, therefore, they've translated into for the leadership there in Belarus.
So first of all, when we talk about sanctions, I see how our partners distinguish Belarusian regime and Belarusian people. And of course, we urge our democratic allies to put very targeted sanctions that would harm Lukashenko's oligarchs and Lukashenko's regime. So we don't want people to be harmed. We want people to give more opportunities, to travel, to see how democracy looks like, not to ban Belarusian, but to ban Belarusian regime. So we don't actually see that level of life of Belarusians is worsening. But what we see for sure that funds, for Lukashenko's pockets is decreasing, and this is the target. So they stopped get money for selling potash or for for different transactions, and it's very important that the regime is punished for militarizing our economy. They now producing tons and tons of military products for Russian army, and of course they have to be punished for this.
Okay, in terms of the sanctions that have targeted Lukashenko and his inner circle, are there any signs that they've had the desired effect? Because we have heard about these presidential pardons for some people involved in the protests of 2020. And I'm just wondering whether perhaps this is a sign that the leadership there in Minsk is trying to reach out to Washington, reach out to the West, presumably because they're feeling the effects of the sanctions. What are your thoughts?
So my thoughts is that sanctions do work. Pressure does work. And the fact that people are being released, from Lukashenko's prisons, it's not just merit of Lukashenko. It's not his sign of humanity of Lukashenko. It's a result of pressure and diplomatic work with this regime. So our message is continue pressure on the regime for them to change their behavior, because sanctions is instrument. When we see that, for example, repressions are weakening, so we can think about, stopping of some sanctions. If repressions are increasing, so sanctions should be harsher. So till now, for 5 years, we haven't seen any sign that sanctions are or that repressions are weakening. Every day, 12, 15 people are being detained, new trials, people had to flee Belarus because of repressions. Is it change of politics of Lukashenko? No. So that's why until we don't see that repressions are stopped, huge number of political prisoners are released. And by the way, at the moment, it's at least 1,300 political prisoners, huge number. So only then we can see that regime, want to have some dialogue with the Belarusian people. Of course, they would like to change the policy of our democratic partners, just lifting sanctions in exchange of nothing. And this is where democratic forces' work is essential. We are in constant communication with our European partners, with our American partners. Don't leave sanctions, for nothing. Don't appease Lukashenko. Don't try to re-educate them. There should be a very clear demand. Stop repressions, release all political prisoners, and hold free and fair elections. This is the demand of Belarusian people. You can't talk to, Lukashenko regime can't talk to the USA or Europe, avoiding talking to Belarusian people.
Of course, what we've seen in the last couple of weeks is the return, obviously, to power in Washington of President Donald Trump. And he appears to be in favor of improving ties with Moscow. And I'm just wondering whether that's having an impact, and if so, what kind of an impact that's having on the political situation in Belarus right now.
I think that a new U.S. administration brings new opportunities, but also new risks. What matters most is where this strength is directed. It must be directed against the real threat, Putin's Russia. The U.S. has always been a defender of democracy and freedom, and we need a strong and principled America that continues to support Ukraine, maintains pressure on Russia, and stands firm against Lukashenko's regime. And the last thing we need is for dictators like Putin and Lukashenko to feel, emboldened. They thrive on division in the West. They exploit any sign of weakness. And I hope that no matter who is in the White House, the message remains clear. The United States will not accept dictatorship in Belarus. It will not legitimize Lukashenko. It will stand with the Ukrainian and Belarusian people in our struggle for democracy and freedom. Because a peaceful, strong, and united Europe, Belarus and Ukraine are part of European family of countries, is not only in Europe's interest, it's in America's interest as well.
So if President Trump manages to broker an end to the war in Ukraine with President Vladimir Putin, on whatever terms, were the fighting to end, Belarus would then presumably try to rebuild some of its economic cooperation with Western countries. I'm assuming that's what they'd do. Correct me if I'm wrong. Were that to happen, wouldn't that therefore mean that President Lukashenko's position was then strengthened somehow?
First of all, we don't have President Lukashenko. We have a person who seized power in Belarus and unleashed the most brutal terror our country has seen for years. But what I do believe is that Belarus must not be a bargaining chip in any peace talks. Because peace cannot mean appeasement. It cannot mean sacrificing Belarus to Russia in some deal. For too long, Belarus has seen as buffer zone or pawn in geopolitical games. But we are not Russia's backyard. We are a European nation. And, Lukashenko is the biggest ally to Putin. Lukashenko is the biggest liar. Before he betrayed democratic values and principles, new appeasement will return us, to the same situation. So we not just have to release people from prisons, and to leave status quo. We have to return our nation to Belarusian people. It doesn't matter what Lukashenko wants. What matters is what Belarusian people want. And we want to return to our European family of countries. We don't want to be in a sphere of influence of Russia, and we want to restore justice in our country.
One of the things we've heard Lukashenko saying in the last couple of days, he's accusing the United States of somehow trying to drive a wedge between Moscow and Beijing. Help us understand what he's trying to say here. What's he implying?
It's what dictators usually do. They are trying to find, external enemies They think that everybody influences everybody. And Lukashenko always say that somebody wants to invade Belarus, that dictator is not guilty in anything. It's like, something happening in the world, and Belarus is like collateral damage. He wants, of course, to clash the strongest, of this world, to be maybe, and he wants to be a very important voice, in these battles, in these processes. But he's like nobody. We have to remember that Lukashenko doesn't represent Belarus. He doesn't represent Belarusian people, and that's why his voice at all shouldn't be included in anywhere.
I just want to ask you, you were at the Munich Security Conference earlier on this month, and I gather you were talking to a lot of the Western leaders who were gathered there, and I'm wondering what sort of a picture you managed to build about the new administration in Washington, sort of priorities and attitudes towards Belarus and indeed the region, because of course Ukraine was a very big focus of that conference.
Of course, the world is changing. I suppose that nobody was ready for changing of the position of the USA. I want to believe that Europe and Ukraine and, of course, the USA, they want peace in our region, but it should be a just and long-lasting peace in Europe. So, of course, it was really sad to see that no Ukrainians and no European Union was invited in the latest talks in Saudi Arabia. I think that such negotiations only embolden Putin and give him a feeling of impunity. It was Russia who started this war, and it's Russia who must stop it. And of course, it became very clear to me, and I suppose that to European Union as well, that Europe must become stronger and not rely solely on US support. And many European politicians, they are ready to take bold steps, and this is exactly what we need. So, the situation is changing, and I see this even experts sometimes, don't understand what will be the result of the situation we have. But I'm sure that we must strengthen military support to Ukraine and ensure that we have to build, to make Ukraine strong as possible, for just peace. But of course, we also cannot forget about Belarus. As President Zelensky mentioned in Munich, the eastern border of Europe also lies on the eastern border of Belarus. So it means that Ukrainians also see Belarus as part of European family of countries. It became very clear that the war against Ukraine is not just about Ukraine. It's about the entire region, including Moldova and Belarus. And this is why the EU must be at the negotiation table and ensuring that Belarus is not traded away and that peace brings security to all of Europe.
Just lastly, I want to ask after your husband, Sergei, are you able to speak to him? Do you have any news as to how he's doing?
Lukashenko's regime started to practice new type of torturing political prisoners, is keeping them in incommunicado mode or forced disappearance, as human rights defenders call it. So on the 9th of March, 2025, it will be 2 years since I haven't heard from my husband. So no letters, lawyer is not allowed to visit him. I don't know if he's alive, where he is, in what state he is. And of course, it's very painful. We have many people like my husband from whom we haven't heard for 2 and more years. But those brave heroes who sacrificed their freedom for future of Belarus, they are like private enemies of Lukashenko's regime. And that's why the world has to demand release of these people and at least get access to see if these people, are still alive in prisons.
Okay, well, we wish him and we wish you the very best. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, thank you very much indeed for your time today.
Thank you.
That is all we have time for on today's edition of Global News Today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. We'll be here with you tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.